the other social institutions that we're looking at, the family exists everywhere, but with many cultural variations. Certain general principles are universal, though. Let's look at families throughout the world. What is the family? When we think of traditional families, we think of biological children of a specific father and mother who are married to each other, living in a household with no other people. That's actually not all that traditional and has only existed for a brief period of time and only in limited parts of the world. Other forms of family are much more traditional. The nuclear family consists of a married couple and their unmarried children living together. The number of nuclear families has steadily decreased over the past 50 years. By 2013, only 1 out of 5 U.S. households actually fit this model. An extended family is a family in which relatives such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc., live in the same home as parents and their children. Extended families provide greater emotional and financial support and have actually been more traditional throughout the world and throughout history than nuclear families living all by themselves. Marriage takes various forms too. Monogamy is a form of marriage in which an individual has only one partner. Serial monogamy refers to a person who has had several spouses in his or her lifetime, but only one at a time. So while we think that the United States has a monogamy norm, actually, there are a great many people who have had at least 2 spouses, just not at the same time. Serial monogamy is becoming normative here. There are 2 types of polygamy. Polygamy means being married to more than one person at the same time. Polygyny refers to the marriage of one man to more than one woman at a time. Polyandry refers to a woman with more than one husband at the same time. Although both exist in different cultures, around the world polygyny with multiple wives is much more common than polyandry. If you're interested in more information about those forms, especially polyandry, which is so rare, just shoot me an email. Kinship is defined by cultures. The state of being related to others is called kinship. It's culturally learned and follows a system of descent. You're only considered kin if you're in bilateral descent. Both sides of a person's family are regarded as equal. In patrilineal descent, only the father's relatives are important in terms of property, inheritance, and emotional ties. And sometimes the mother's relatives aren't even considered relatives at all. In matrilineal descent, only the mother's relatives are significant, and again, sometimes the father's parents and other relatives aren't considered relatives at all to the children in the family. Who qualifies as a cousin, who qualifies as an in-law, all of those things are defined by culture and come with different rules regarding how we're supposed to interact with those people. In a patriarchal family, males are expected to dominate family decision making. In patriarchal families and societies that encourage them, men may find divorce easier than women do, particularly in terms of economic outcomes. And in some places, women aren't allowed to divorce their husbands at all. Women have greater authority than men in matriarchies, which are historically very, very rare, if they exist at all. And in an egalitarian family, authority is shared between the spouses. Egalitarian families are becoming more common in the United States. Can you see how Family structure would both reflect and create the society in general. In very patriarchal societies, there are very patriarchal families. For example, the church tends to be very patriarchal. The government tends to be very patriarchal. The education system tends to be very patriarchal. It all reflects and builds each other. That's how a functionalist would analyze the relationships between family as the backbone of society and the rest of society. We'll talk about that again when we get to perspectives. Really need the family? Can we replace its functions with other institutions? Ingalls, in 1884, described the family as the ultimate source of social inequality. Families gratify the needs of members and contribute to the stability of society. Functionalist William F. Ogburn outlined 6 paramount functions of family: reproduction, protection, socialization, regulation of sexual behavior, affection and companionship, and providing social status. Clearly, some of these functions have been shifted to outside groups, such as education and recreation, and there are also certainly dysfunctions embedded in every family system. From the conflict perspective, family is a reflection of inequality in wealth and power, perpetuated by male dominance. Family is viewed as an economic unit that contributes to social injustice. Children inherit the class status of their parents, and that's partially through the use of the last name of the parent. Interactionist micro-level analysis focuses on how individuals interact within the family and other intimate relationships, and what being part of a family or the use of a particular term, label, means. For example, father and children interaction as it relates to behavioral problems, studies related to behavior of step families, studies that look at the difference in relationship within families when children call their step parents mom or dad as opposed to their first names or some other label. Research on gender roles in childcare and household chores has been extensive, particularly within the feminist perspective. Feminist theorists have urged others to rethink the notion that families with no adult male are automatically cause for concern. Other areas of research includes that of single women, single-parent households, and lesbian couples. Feminists who take the interactionist perspective stress the need to investigate neglected topics in family studies, such as dual-income households in which the woman earns more than her husband. Marriage is still very normative in the United States, with over 95% of all men and women in the United States marrying at least once in their lifetimes. Though it may seem simple to say that we marry because we fall in love with someone, it's very interesting how clear and pervasive the patterns are in who we're likely to fall in love with. It's really not particularly random. Internet romance via matchmaking services has taken on a much larger role in mate selection in recent years. Traditional courtship rituals are still dominant in places like Uzbekistan, where a female will be socialized to anticipate marriage to a man she only meets once. The process is taking longer than in the past. Many people are delaying their entrance into marriage, and cohabitation is increasingly likely. Be sure you know what cohabitation means. Jot down a brief definition of the difference between the words median and average. It's a very different concept. This is median age at first marriage in 8 countries. It doesn't mean it's their average age. Check that out. Endogamy specifies that people are expected to marry within their own racial, ethnic, or religious group. It reinforces group cohesiveness. You may not know that we have a very strong endogamy norm, but we do. Although it has increased in the United States, interracial and interethnic marriages are actually still quite the exception. Exogamy requires mate selection outside certain groups. We have a strong exogamous norm as well. We don't marry our own relatives, for example. And most of us marry outside our gender. Incest taboos prohibit sexual relationships between culturally specified relatives. In the US, this means we must marry outside the nuclear family, but that's defined differently in different places. There is an incest taboo everywhere, however. Homogamy is the conscious or unconscious tendency to choose a mate with very similar personalities and cultural interests. The more homogamous a couple is in terms of their background, the more likely they are to remain a stable couple over the long haul, more than 25 years. In the US, we think love is important in courtship as a rationale for marriage, but love is not universal for marriage in all cultures. Arranged marriages are the basis for mate selection in many cultures and in some subcultures within the US. Many people remain married when they are no longer consider themselves in love as well. And some people don't marry people that they are in love with for various reasons. So it's complicated. There are differences in in the average families in various socioeconomic statuses. Upper class families emphasize the lineage of family position. Lower class families struggle to pay bills and survive. Middle class families are more permissive than lower class families, which tend to be more authoritative. However, these differences have narrowed recently. Among the college educated, both spouses tend to delay marriage, and divorce rates are relatively low among college educated people when compared to non college educated people. Women play a significant economic role in poor families. For example, in 2014, 31% of all families headed by women with no husband present were below the poverty line. The poverty rate for married couples is only 6.2%. There are variations by race and ethnic group as well. The subordinate status of racial and ethnic minorities affects family life, and their family constellations also affect their social status. African American families suffer from negative and inaccurate stereotypes. Predominantly female kin networks often ease financial strains among Black families headed by single mothers. There is an emphasis on deep religious commitment and aspirations for achievement in Black family life. Native Americans draw on family ties to cushion many of the hardships they face as well. Mexican Americans exhibit strong familialism or pride in the extended family, which is expressed through the maintenance of close ties and strong obligations to kinfolk outside the immediate family. Mexican American men exhibit something called machismo. Familialism can also have negative consequences. Today, fewer than 1 in 5 children in the US lives in a household which has a father present and working, a mother also present, and no other step or custodial children present. Think about what that means when we talk about the traditional family. Parenthood is one of the most important social roles in the United States. Alice Rossi identified 4 factors that complicate parenthood. We have, first, little anticipatory socialization for the caregiving role, particularly for fathers. Limited learning occurring during the pregnancy period. Abruptness of transition to parenthood, and lack of clear societal guidelines for what successful parenthood looks like. There is little consensus on how parents can produce happy, well-adjusted children, and it's very difficult to research such a thing. About 10% of all children live with a grandparent, 9% of white children, 17% of black children, and 14% of Hispanic children. In about a third of these homes, no parent was present. Adoption is a process that allows the transfer of legal rights, responsibilities, and privileges of parenthood to a new legal parent or parents. Functionalists suggest that government policy should encourage adoption for stability. There are 2 legal methods for adoption: licensed agencies and, in some states, private agreement. In 1995, New York held that couples do not have to be married to adopt. Until then, they did. Under this ruling, unmarried heterosexual couples, lesbian and gay couples can all legally adopt. Today, most states permit adoption by gay and lesbian couples. The 2015 earthquake in Haiti drew attention to some problems with international adoption. There were children who were taken from Haiti who had parents who wanted them back, um, but who had insufficient funds or other limitations. And those children were brought to America and adopted and basically were kidnapped. The majority of married people are dual wage earners out of economic need. The increase in the proportion of men and women who desire to pursue careers contributes to the increase in dual income families. Participation of women in the labor force is associated with both the rise in the number of married couples who live apart for reasons other than marital problems or discord, and in the increased acceptance of the egalitarian family type. Jot down a definition for the word egalitarian just for your own purposes, but make sure I can see it. Single parent family, in which there's only one parent present caring for children, carries stigma. The stigma attached to unwed mothers and other single parents has significantly declined, though, in recent years. In 2015, a single parent headed about 1/5 or 20% of white families with children under 18, 29% of Hispanic families with children, and well over 50%, actually close to 60% of African American families with children. So the likelihood is 3 times higher in the African American community than in the white community. The majority of babies born to unwed teenage mothers are born to white adolescents. 84% of single-parent households in the U.S. are headed by mothers. However, households headed by single fathers more than quadrupled between 1980 and 2013. Single fathers tend to be more isolated than single mothers. And I want to move back for just a second, and I want you to listen to a statistic one more time. I told you that 58% of African American families with children are headed by a single mother, and only 20% of white families. I also told you that the majority of babies born to unwed teenage mothers are born to white adolescent girls. How can you make some sense out of those numbers? How can both of those things be true? Rising rates of divorce and remarriage have increased the number of step-family relationships. Children of step families may not be better off than children of divorced single-parent households due to the conflicts within the household. Compared to children raised by biological mothers, children raised in step families, particularly with stepmothers, are likely to have less health care, less education, and less money for food. Family life in the United States often incorporates conflicting commitments that can undermine a marriage, to the marriage itself, but also to self-expression and personal growth. In many countries, divorce began to increase in the late 1960s, but it has declined since the 1980s. Men who divorce are more likely to remarry than women who divorce. Retaining custody of children after a divorce can complicate new adult relationships. Some regard the remarriage rate as an endorsement of the institution of marriage, but it does lead to more complex kin networks which can introduce new challenges. Second marriages are even more likely to end in divorce than first marriages are. The reasons for rising divorce rates include greater social acceptance of divorce worldwide, negative attitudes of religious denominations have relaxed, most U.S. states have adopted liberal divorce laws. Divorce is a more practical option than it used to be, since U.S. families today tend to have fewer children. The general increase in family income and the availability of free legal aid to some poor make divorce more affordable. Women are less dependent on their husbands both economically and emotionally, and feel abler to leave bad marriages. Children are impacted by their parents' divorces. Some suggest divorce is a welcomed end for children witnessing family dysfunction, though. A national study that tracked 6,332 children, both before and after their parents' divorce, found that their behavior did not necessarily suffer from marital breakups. Custodial arrangements and the issue of child support payments are complications that can negatively impact children of divorced parents. Any sort of marital discord can be a problem, and in many cases, divorcing parents treat their children like pawns in a big game, and that can also increase the problems. A lot of variation in gay and lesbian relationships, too. Some lesbian and gay men live alone or with roommates, others live in long-term monogamous relationships, and every kind of variation, just like heterosexual people. With the 2015 ruling in the Supreme Court, it was declared that the Constitution guarantees the right to same-sex marriage. States and social agencies are now dealing with same-sex divorce, which is complicated by issues of jurisdiction for couples that married in states where same-sex marriage was legal, but before same-sex marriage became legal nationwide. Although significant barriers remain, progress has been made in tackling discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. In many countries and cultures, especially developing ones, marriage is still seen as a rite of passage into the adult world. In the United States, marriage has lost much of its social significance as a marker of adulthood. Cohabitation refers to male-female couples who choose to live together without marrying. The number of households in the U.S. that are headed by unmarried, opposite-sex couples has been rising steadily. In 2015, it was over 8 million. Cohabitation is also extremely common in Europe. Cohabitation is no longer associated more strongly with younger childless couples. In 2002, President George W. Bush attempted to bolster the desirability of a lifelong commitment to marriage with the Healthy Marriage and Responsible Fatherhood initiative. There used to be a common law marriage um, provision in Alabama state law where if you lived together and called yourselves married, you were married, regardless of whether you filed it at the courthouse or not. That is no longer the case. Fewer than 4% of women and men in the United States are likely to remain single throughout their whole lives. Postponing marriage is related to the growing economic independence of young people, a trend that is especially significant for women. Single persons may choose not to limit their sexual intimacy to one lifetime partner and not to become highly dependent on any one person. Divorced singles may form solid, supportive relationships with others for, for child rearing and thus may not feel pressured to repartner. Remaining single still represents a departure from social expectations. There's been a modest increase in childlessness in the United States, with about 16 to 17% of women will complete their childbearing years without having born any children, compared to 10% in 1980. More and more couples choose to regard themselves as child-free rather than childless. Economic considerations have contributed to this shift in attitudes. Childless couples generally applaud employers' efforts to provide childcare and flexible work schedules for parents, but are beginning to question how fair such policies are to those employees without children. Two-earner families or dual-earner families with no kids are referred to as DINKs, double income, no kids. Stage, the U.S. is in kind of a strange place with regard to our policies on family. By 2010, the U.S. was the only industrialized nation that did not mandate an employer to provide paid family leave. Family leave in the U.S. is left to the employer's discretion, a situation that is not at all typical. Worldwide, 98 nations provide a minimum of 14 weeks of maternity leave, and 107 nations require some pay during a woman's leave. Paternity leave, or leave for fathers, is less common but is increasing. Functionalists see family leave as particularly important as a means of facilitating the parent-child interaction that is crucial to socialization. Interactionists see family leave policy as having a direct impact on everyday relations, both at work and at home. Conflict theorists see an inherent class bias in family leave policy in the U.S., where employees who receive paid leave are relatively affluent. Wealthier people are more likely to have paid leave than poor people. Dividing family leave policies between different classes of workers will only contribute to inequality. Feminist scholars point out the reality that 70% of today's children live in households with two working adults. And when family leave plans exist, the use of them is stigmatized. Interactionists would examine that as well. Flexibility stigma refers to the devaluation of workers who seek or are presumed to need flexible work arrangements. Advocates have sought, so far unsuccessfully, to expand the provisions of the 1993 Family and Medical Leave Act, which entitled eligible employees of covered employers to take at least unpaid but job-protected leave with continued health insurance for certain family and medical reasons, including childbirth. Opponents to expanded provisions question the costs. Some private corporations have introduced path-breaking family-friendly policies. You can check on how Facebook handles it, for example. Parental leave enjoys wide support worldwide, but while over three-quarters of Americans want paid maternity or paternity leave, only 7% want the government to pay for it. This is an especially interesting comparison of family constellations by race or ethnicity, and trends over the past, since 1970 up till 2015, which is the last data that's available.